Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event from London for the launch of the 2022 Innovation Report. My name's Tim Minshall. I'm the Dr. John C. Taylor Professor of Innovation and the head of the Institute for Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge. Thank you so much for joining us today. A tiny bit of framing and a bit of housekeeping before we get started. So the idea for this report emerged a few years back when it was recognized that there was a need for those who have significant decision-making responsibility in relation to innovation to have access to data that's readily accessible, that's timely, and that's grounded in what's happening within firms that are changing rapidly in a very dynamic context. And so before we get started, just a few thanks, but to avoid missing anybody, we're just going to make it a general thank you to everybody who's been involved in providing inputs to this report, for doing the analysis of all the data, of the huge amount of data that's been brought together, and those who've been involved in the production of both the report, the website, and this event as well. So I'm just going to run through the agenda briefly, and one quick change to the agenda. Lord Sainsbury is unable to join us today. So I'm just going to run through how we'll run the next hour and a half of this event. In a second, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Owen OSullivan, who is the Director of the University of Cambridge Centre for Science, Technology and Innovation Policy, to set the scene for this year's report. We'll then hand over to Carlos Lopez Gomez, who leads the Policy Links Unit at the University of Cambridge Institute for Manufacturing, will then provide an overview of the key findings from this year's report. Then we're going to change tack slightly and then open it up for a panel discussion involving two extra contributors, Martin Turner from the UK Bioindustry Association and from Matthew Croucher from SMMT. And the idea there will be that the four of us, me chairing it, Carlos, Martin and Matthew, then reflecting on the details of this year's report. You will, of course, as the audience, have a chance to put forward any questions you'd like to ask based on the report itself. If you could, though, please put them into the Q&A function on this Zoom call, and my colleagues beavering away in the background will make sure that the questions are filtered and passed to me to answer. We may not be able to cover answers to all the questions, so apologies in advance for that, but we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. And without further ado then, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Owen OSullivan, who's joining us on a link from Cambridge. Owen, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Good afternoon. I'm just going to make some brief introductory remarks. I'm going to give some background to the report, especially as it relates to our industrial innovation policy community here in Cambridge, and then just give some quick personal reflections on the report and why I believe it's so useful and why the approach taken is so valuable. Before, as Tim says, handing over to Carlos, whose team has done all of the work and who will properly introduce the report and its findings. First of all, I think one important early point that I think is worth making up front is that while this is called an innovation report, it's not just another collection of the obvious innovation metrics in some slightly different combination. It's doing, I think, much more than that. It's fundamentally focused on, I think, trying to better understand the relationship between innovation, technological innovation, and industrial performance. So what it's doing is it's juxtaposing innovation performance data with industrial performance data and sort of framing and analyzing these data in the context of real policy questions and issues of real interest to industry as well, I think. And it is this interest in the relationship between innovation and industrial performance that also defines our industrial innovation policy community here in Cambridge. The core groups involved are three different but complementary policy-focused activities, all with their origins at the Institute for Manufacturing, IFM, where Tim, our chair, is director. Central to today's event is the Policy Knowledge Exchange consulting team, the Policy Links Unit led by Carlos, the team that developed the report, but there's also the Babbage Forum led by Sir Mike Gregory, who many of you will know, which convenes extremely eminent international multidisciplinary mix of economists and engineers and management scholars and policymakers interested in issues of industrial strategy and manufacturing. And then there is also the Academic Technology and Innovation Policy Research Centre, which I run also with an IFM, also working closely with different bits of government and innovation agencies. And we have this common interest in technological research and innovation systems, so the networks through which new technical knowledge is developed and diffused and deployed, and industrial value chain sector systems, the networks of firms through which sectoral value-adding activities are distributed within the economy. And in particular, we're interested in how these systems interact with each other and the implications for competitiveness and growth, and of course, policy, hence industrial innovation policy, which is not an actual recognized term of art, although we think it probably should be. So I think much of the motivation for this report, this now annual report, comes from our shared experience working closely with different bits of government and on projects at this interface between research and innovation policy and manufacturing policy, sector policies. And the challenge that the relevant data and evidence is scattered and distributed among different agencies and reports and databases, and is not always compatible, and it's certainly not all in one place. I think in particular, the policy evidence can be all too easily siloed into indicators related to innovation and indicators related to industry, making it harder than it should be to explore this hugely important, I think, relationship between innovation and national industrial performance. I think maybe a secondary motivation is that between us, we've done a lot of international comparative studies, including looking at sources of policy evidence for these kinds of issues in different countries. And I think we've been struck, especially recently, by how some national innovation reports in some countries and in their discussions and analysis of innovation are paying more attention to the trends and details of particular sectors and subsectors, and to the capabilities and opportunities of particular sectors and subsectors and how these are changing. And some of these reports are trying to represent and combine these data in new and interesting and more useful ways. So we've seen some innovation in innovation reporting, as it were. And I think this has also somewhat inspired this report and motivated its approach. So that's at least part of the origin story of this report and the approach that's being taken. Again, I think Carlos will go through the content and some of the key findings in a moment, but I thought I would just very quickly point to a few things that struck me that I think illustrate the value of the report. Well, first of all, I should say that despite having previously properly immersed myself sort of down in the details of last year's report, I still found this year's edition fascinating. There were trends and patterns I wasn't expecting. There were novel combinations of data I hadn't seen before. And I think new to this year's report, alongside the data, were these accompanying insights from industry experts, offering some diagnosis of some of the trends in the data that were extremely thought-provoking. In terms of data, I think one of the things that stood out for me was was international comparative data for contributions by individual sectors to national productivity and growth. And addressing a long-standing frustration of mine, the report actually has comparative data that includes some of the key interesting non-OECD countries, so like Singapore, which is really interesting in the context of sectors like pharma and issues of foreign direct investment, and also data from Taiwan, important in the context of things like semiconductors. And there's even comparative data for China. And policymakers always want to know how these things compare with what's going on in China. And again, Carlos can correct me if I'm wrong, but you almost never see this comparative data for, I think, technical challenges I won't pretend to fully understand about reconciling some national data sets, but I'm not sure there's anywhere you can get access to this data presented in this way. So I think there's a lot of people who are going to find it extremely valuable. I think it was also fascinating to see national innovation indicators alongside relevant firm level data. So things like rankings of the most R&D intensive firms in terms of investment and patenting activity. Data you can find, but it's normally not put side by side, and it's really thought-provoking when it is. The report also has, I think, a great section on national comparative data for skills and technical education, again, revealing some things that were surprising to me, at least. So for example, the quite large variance in how much engineering does or does not contribute to overall national STEM graduate numbers. So it seems there's comparatively less E in STEM, if you pardon the expression, in the UK than I would have expected. So really interesting things that you just see because of the way the data is being combined. And I think finally, so in this year's report, as I said before, the insights and inputs from the industry experts alongside the data was a great addition, raising really interesting questions about national capabilities to scale up new technologies, national specialization in particular sector segments, and also raising questions about future industrial value chain configurations, a future automotive sector focused on electric vehicles where advanced batteries and specialist chemicals are going to be key, a next wave of pharma manufacturing related to advanced therapeutics. So issues where understanding the interdependencies of national research and innovation systems and value chain systems are right at the heart of any strategizing for future economic opportunities and related capability development. So finally, I think while the inputs from industry experts are maybe qualitative and don't necessarily provide definitive answers or definitively explain what's going on in the trend data, they are, as I say, extremely thought-provoking and I think invaluable in starting a conversation, which I think is a key goal of this report, stimulating discussion and debate about UK's relative performance to competitors, the importance of sector level of analysis, the importance of diagnosing issues and trends in that sector data that really should be properly understood in the context of trade deals or inward investment strategies or any efforts to translate science superpower capabilities into economic opportunities. So maybe let me stop there. I think I've used up my time. It's a wonderful report, one that I think a lot of people are going to find extremely useful. So let me just finish by congratulating Carlos and his team. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion this afternoon that this report will stimulate. Thanks, Tim.
Owen, thank you so much. Brilliant setting of the scene and highlighting why this report needs to be an annual thing and needs to keep not only finding out new things, but spotting the gaps where things are not yet being addressed. Really helpful, Owen. Much appreciate that. Thank you. And now I'd like to hand straight over to Carlos Lopez Gomez to give us a summary of the key findings of this year's innovation report. Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Carlos Lopez Gomez from the Policy Links Unit, which is the knowledge transfer arm of the Institute for Manufacturing, IFM Engage in Cambridge. Thank you all for joining the event. My job today is really to give you some highlights of the UK Innovation Report 2022. And I would like to start by thanking my colleagues at the Policy Links Unit, Jennifer Castañeda, Liz Killen, David Leal, and Michele Palladino, who are the people who actually did the work and just sent me here to present. Also, thanks to Ella Wellams and Jason Naselli for planning this event. Finally, thanks to Anna Rincon at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, who provided technical advice, and to all the organizations that participated in the consultations carried out for the report. So we have around 100 charts in the report. You'll be pleased to know that I'll only go through a few of them. But first, I would like to give you the big picture of the motivation and what is covered in the report. So this is an overview of the themes and the sections covered in the report. So the first one, structure and performance of the UK economy, addresses the questions of how the structure of the UK economy has changed in the last few years, and how are these changes affecting economic performance compared to other countries. Section 2, investment in innovation, addresses the question of whether the UK government and the private sector are spending enough on R&D compared to other countries. Section 3, industrial performance, explores how UK industries are performing in terms of productivity, value added, and employment, and whether they are investing enough on R&D compared to international competitors. And this year's edition of the report focuses particularly on two sectors, the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector and the automotive manufacturing sectors, and we'll be talking about that today. Section 4 looks at science and engineering workforce, looking at how the UK compares in terms of the production of scientists, engineers, and technicians. And finally, section 5, which is a special theme in this edition of the report, looks at net zero innovation, exploring how the UK performs internationally in terms of R&D investment, patents, and economic growth in this area. So I will leave the findings of section 3 for the end to set the context of the panel discussions that we have later on. So let's start with section 1. In section 1, structure and performance of the UK economy, we find that in the last 2 decades, the share in the UK economy of high productivity sectors such as manufacturing and mining have reduced. The share of these sectors has been reduced, while the participation of sectors such as construction and services has grown. As you can see in this graph, this includes both knowledge-intensive services such as finance and ICT, as well as more labor-intensive service sectors such as administrative and support services. But what is striking in this graph, if you see the bottom part of the graph, is manufacturing sector here. Is this one of the sectors with the highest productivity growth rates in the economy in the last 20 years, but also the one sector whose share in the economy has decreased the most, from 16.1 to 9.7 during this period. So what does that mean? In order to better understand how sectors contribute to national productivity growth, the report presents decompositions of the contribution of each sector, which tells us how sectors contribute differently to national productivity growth depending on their share of the economy, their relative productivity, and how fast their productivity and employment grows. So we compare this to what happens in other countries. So this table shows you how sectors contribute to national productivity growth in a selection of countries that you see in the table. So in red, you see here the ones that have a negative contribution to productivity growth, and in green, those that have a positive contribution in productivity growth. So again, we don't have time to go into the details of each of these sectors, but just might be worth highlighting the case of manufacturing, which, as you can see in the table, it's green for most of the countries, but red or very red for the UK. So the decomposition reveals that manufacturing was responsible for around 30% of aggregate productivity growth in China and Korea, and almost half in Taiwan in the last 2 decades. So, however, it has had a negative contribution to productivity growth in the UK. And again, the decomposition tells us that the loss of manufacturing, that is the reduction in its share of the economy, has imposed a penalty on UK productivity growth of 0.5 percentage point on average for the last 2 decades. So quite a striking trend there, that it really looks different in different countries. Now, in the section investment in innovation, section 2, we find that at 1.74%, the UK's gross domestic expenditure on R&D, or GERD, remains well below the 2019 OECD average. As you can see in the darker line, the OECD average has moved now to 2.5%, which technically the 2.4% target that Tim mentioned is technically a bit outdated already. So the UK government has committed to invest £22 billion in R&D, but this commitment has been pushed back from 2024 to 2026, 2027. At the firm level, the report has data on firm activity on R&D investment and patenting. And we find that very few firms headquartered in the UK are global leaders in R&D investment and patent applications. So in 2020, only 2 companies headquartered in the UK were amongst the top 100 R&D investing firms in the world, and no firms headquartered in the UK were among the top 100 patent applicants at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, which is usually used for benchmarking. Arm and Rolls-Royce were the top patent applicant firms in the UK, ranking 103 and 135th in the world, respectively. In the section Science and Engineering Workforce, we see that tertiary education attainment in the UK is well above OECD average, and over 40% of UK graduates are found in STEM disciplines, above France, Canada, and the US. Recent data from the OECD shows, however, that within STEM, I think Owen mentioned the E in STEM, the share of graduates in the category engineering, manufacturing, and construction remains relatively low at 8.4%, especially when compared to countries such as Germany and Korea. is the dark red in this graph. So enrollment rates in post-secondary education courses below the standard 3-year bachelor's degree are comparatively low in the UK when compared with countries such as the US, Korea, and France. This is often referred to as the missing middle in workforce skills. In January 2021, the UK government published a white paper, Skills for Job, which recognizes a, quote, significant shortage of vital technician level STEM skills, end of quote. The white paper made proposals such as expanding the institutes of technology, continuing with the T-level programs, and more generally, reforming the post-A-level education system. The importance of boosting STEM skills is also widely recognized in the UK innovation strategy. In the section Net Zero Innovation, we find that the UK is the 17th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. The UK is one of the global leaders in both public R&D budget and patenting of net zero and net zero related technologies. The UK ranks 8th in the registration of climate change mitigation technologies, CCMT, as you can see in the graph, behind only Japan, the US, Germany, Korea, China, France, and Taiwan. Technologies in this group include carbon capture and storage, energy, and waste management. Now, the ONS defines the low carbon and renewable energy economy, LCREE, as 17 low carbon sectors, including wind, renewable, photovoltaics, carbon capture, nuclear, and energy efficiency and energy efficient products. The total turnover of these sectors was around 43 billion in 2019. As shown in this chart, 10 out of 17 of these sectors, however, have recorded a decline in turnover between 2014 and 2019. Now, we have arrived to the section looking at the performance of selected UK sectors. And I'll start by going through some of the highlights from the analysis of the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector. Of the top 13 countries by pharmaceutical value added in 2018 that are shown in this graph, the UK is the only one to have experienced a significant decline in productivity at a rate of minus 7.9% per year between 2008 and 2018. So in this graph, we see which countries are growing and which countries are declining. And we see countries with high and growing productivity, such as Switzerland and Belgium. Very specialized countries with much higher levels of productivity, such as Singapore and Ireland, and we see the decline of the UK on the bottom of the chart. At the same time, the UK from the period 2010 to 2020 has recorded deficits in pharmaceutical manufacturing almost in all years except 2015. And the trade balance going from 9.7 billion US dollars in 2010 to a deficit of over 1 billion in 2020. This is the latest data available. So quite a striking trend there as well in terms of the balance of trade of pharmaceutical manufacturing products in the UK. Business expenditure on R&D in pharma has remained largely stagnant, as you can barely see in the graph at the bottom, with the sector spending only 6% more in 2018 than it did in 2008, compared to increases of around 30% in the US and Germany, and over 100% in Korea. So in absolute terms, business R&D expenditure in UK pharma remains comparatively lower than that of Korea and Germany, and an order of magnitude lower than that of the US, as you can see in the chart. So in an attempt to understand the reality behind this data, we have carried out a number of interviews with stakeholders from industry and government, including funding program agencies, funding program management agencies, innovation centers, industry associations, and private sector organizations. Thank you all, again, to all of these organizations that took the time to talk to us. So the drivers behind the trends that I've just mentioned in value-added productivity and R&D that our stakeholders highlighted include the following. First, the company restructuring and site closures, including those by major sector employers, as reported in the Office for Life Sciences, Bioscience and Health Technology sector statistics. Increased offshoring of pharma manufacturing. So there seems to be a greater degree of firm mobility in the pharmaceutical sector than in other industries as a result of shorter factory life, lower scale operations, and lower capital embedded in facilities and the supply chain. This has affected a large share of advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, and led to a growing role of contract development and manufacturing companies, CDMOs. Limited manufacturing investment coming from abroad, as recognized in the 2017 Life Science Industrial Strategy. The second wave of manufacturing investments on new plant and equipment for the manufacture of biologics and other novel medicines has largely gone to other countries, including Ireland, Singapore, Germany, and the US, which together have attracted the bulk of $125 billion of investment in pharma manufacturing between 2011 and 2017. Challenges to the scale up of manufacturing technologies developed in the UK. As Tim mentioned before, there is a common concern that technologies and products that were originally developed in the UK have not been commercialized or manufactured here. This is recognized specifically in the Life Sciences Vision published by the government in July 2021. For example, despite the discovery of monoclonal antibodies in the UK, the country has failed to capitalize on this by securing commercial manufacturing of these products. The fact that other countries offer more attractive incentives to R&D, availability of technicians, both the literature review and interviews recognize difficulties in recruiting highly qualified workers in core scientific disciplines such as biologic and chemical sciences, a wide range of computational disciplines, and clinical pharmacology. The consultees also mentioned that the UK has lower proportions of skilled technicians with specific sector knowledge than other competitor countries, and business models that reduce in-house R&D in favor of acquisitions. So ONS data suggests that 65% of the 610 companies registered as pharmaceutical manufacturing companies in the UK at the start of 2018 were micro firms, which means fewer than five employees. The interviewees highlighted that the UK has developed a strong presence of startups, many of which focus on new discoveries and operate in loss-making models while these developments get to market. As suggested by the UK Bioindustry Association, smaller innovative companies often operate on an outsourcing model, whereby they rely on universities and other companies to conduct R&D on their behalf. Of course, these are just some of the key factors identified during consultations, and more work needs to be done to better understand the magnitude of the influence of each of them on the innovation and economic performance of the sector. And that's what we want to discuss in the panel later on today. So now I'm moving to automotive manufacturing sector, which is the last section of my presentation. The UK belongs to a group of nations where productivity was high and rising over the 2008 to 2018 period, together with Germany, Korea, and the US, as you can see there in the blue bubble. Since 2010, however, the UK has recorded a persistent trade deficit, which stands at around $21.8 billion in 2020. Industry studies suggest that 50% local target 50% local content by value is a plausible target for the overall car industry. So the amount of components that UK automotive production uses and sources from within the UK. UK business enterprise expenditure on R&D for automotive grew at an impressive average rate of 11.7% between 2009 and 2016, but growth has slowed in 2015 and 2018. Overall, total UK business enterprise expenditure in R&D and automotive remains an order of magnitude lower than competitor countries. So same exercise, trying to think about the drivers behind these trends, this is what we heard from the stakeholders consulted. Increased specialization in premium segments, pushing value added per capita up. SMMT data for 2018 shows that 45% of all cars produced in the UK were in premium products, while 1.7 were luxury and sport car. So that specialization pushing value added per capita up. Many people refer to this transition to low carbon vehicles that has implications for investment decisions. The UK, as I'm sure you know, has set a target for phasing out internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030. Interviewees consulted highlighted that the transition to electric and hydrogen vehicles represent both an opportunity but also a challenge for UK automotive sector, as some of the UK's strengths in traditional powertrain design and engine manufacturing could become less important. From the government side, the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund was developed to support the low carbon vehicle transition, committed funding to the Faraday Challenge to develop next generation batteries, design and manufacture in the UK, leading to the establishment of the Faraday Institution and the UK Battery Industrialization Center. Advances in automation obviously having an influence on number of jobs. The decision of original equipment manufacturers, particularly foreign-owned ones, favoring other locations as manufacturing locations, make UK estimates that the proportion of automotive firms, which include both OEMs and suppliers that were foreign-owned in 2018, is over double the average for the manufacturing sector as a whole. And obviously this could have investment location decision implications. Increased international competition pressures from both established nations such as Japan, Germany, and Korea, as well as upcoming countries like Mexico, Thailand, and Poland. Increased uncertainty around trade and investment, not least due to the 2016 EU membership referendum. R&D investment decisions, mainly driven by these foreign OEMs mentioned before. A perceived shortage of technicians. So this was a recurrent topic. Stakeholders expressed concerns about apprenticeships and technical education programs needed to train future workers and upskill existing ones in preparation to the transition to low carbon vehicles. SMMT analysis suggests that the industry is likely to require new skills in industrial chemistry, electrical engineering, virtual modeling, software design, cybersecurity, and digital science, engineering, and architecture. Again, these are topics for the discussion following. So that was my last slide. For more details, we obviously encourage you to go and look at the report. It's online already on our website. Please get in touch with comments and suggestions, which are very helpful to design the next iteration of the report. And now over to Tim.
Great. Thank you very much. We just wait for the camera to pan dramatically around to the panel. That's great. Carlos, thank you very much for that. Really clear, very helpful. So we've got a discussion now around anything related to that report. And if anybody online wishes to pose any questions, please put them into the Q&A function on this Zoom call. They're being fed directly to me, so I can pick these up as we go through. Again, apologies in advance if we don't get through all of them, but please put your questions in. If we can't get through them now, we'll follow up as much as we can afterwards with particular responses. And so a theme of this year's report, Carlos, has been the sector analysis and picking two of the UK's largest sectors. So we're delighted we have two panelists joining us now. So we have Martin Turner and Matthew Croucher, but maybe just to start, would you mind just introducing yourselves and what you do?
Absolutely. So my name is Martin Turner. I'm head of policy and public affairs at the Bioindustry Association. We're a UK trade body for innovative life sciences companies. We represent over 450 members of that community in the UK, and our purpose was really to make the UK the best place in the world to start and grow a life sciences company.
Great, thanks you. Matthew.
Thanks so much. So Matthew Croucher, I'm from the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. That's the trade association for the vehicle manufacturers in the UK, the suppliers in the UK, but also the importers and it's about 800 odd members, so it's one of the larger trade associations. Our job likewise is to promote the UK automotive industry and try and ensure that it remains a very competitive place to invest in, as well as the products that we buy in the UK remains things that consumers want, and move things forward. And obviously at the moment we're going through this massive transition, so really great to see a report which comes along which we can utilize quite a lot of the information from and take forward.
Great. Well, thank you both very much for coming along. It's really appreciated. Because the report does raise a lot of quite challenging issues, points to some really good things that are going on as well, but also some really challenging issues. So maybe just to give you both a chance to respond to what the report itself, and maybe Carlos's summary there, particular issues that struck you, maybe starting with Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, it's a great report and fantastic to have all of that data put into one place. And we're pleased to see the focus on the pharmaceutical industry as well. I think, firstly, what really stands out to me is the strength of the R&D investment in the pharmaceutical industry. So it's consistently, as the graph shows, over the past 10 years or more even, it's the highest investing sector in R&D, 5 billion or so by the latest count. And that's really building on the historic strength of the UK life sciences, academic and industry heritage, really. And I think that high level of R&D investment is incredibly important because it is an industry built on innovation. You have to stay one step ahead of the game. You've got to be developing the next medicine that is going to fundamentally change the treatment for patients. And it's also an industry based around looking after patients as well, treating patients. It does note that the sector is spending less comparatively than other life sciences sectors around the world. And I think, again, that kind of mirrors the academic world as well in the UK, the life sciences academic world, where there's an awful lot of value and innovation squeezed out of quite a small amount of money. It's an incredibly efficient research and innovation ecosystem that we have in the UK. That said, it's absolutely right to say that we've missed out on the second wave of pharmaceutical manufacturing, that the report calls it. Now, those are the products that had their genesis in the 80s and the 90s, and then came onto the market in the late 90s and early noughties. So these are fairly complex biological molecules that many of which, like monoclonal antibodies, as you pointed out, Carlos, were invented here but not commercialized and not manufactured here. And that is a real missed opportunity. And I think there is a third wave of innovation and new medicines coming along, cell and gene therapies, RNA-based therapies, and of course the Pfizer mRNA vaccine is the most well-known of those, but there's all sorts of other ones in the pipeline. But so if we can capture that third wave of manufacturing innovation, then I think we'll see those charts changing in the years to come.
Thank you. There's each of those points. It would be great to explore in a bit more detail. Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute, because it's just here from the automotive motor trade side as well, and motor manufacturers.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. So again, great having all that data in one place, being able to look at it and look at those sort of international comparisons. As an economist, it's always good to get information and be able to utilize that and move things forward. I think within our sector, obviously we've gone through sort of big transitions, and clearly the referendum and the announcement that we were going to leave the EU has caused a bit of a hiatus in investment in the UK. But now we've got the TCA in place. We've now seen in 2021 sort of record announcements. So going back to 2013, sort of levels of announcements in investment into the UK. So that's really positive. But clearly, the industry is very diverse in the UK. So we have the volume manufacturers, we have the premium manufacturers, we have component manufacturers, we have bus, coach manufacturers, we have Formula One teams, and 20 R&D facilities in the UK. So it's really a diverse sector, but it's all needs to transition towards a decarbonisation, the net zero agenda, to move to electrification or other zero emission sort of vehicle technologies. So it gives a tremendous opportunity for the sector, but also obviously a lot of jeopardy for the sector, because we do in the UK have a very strong ICE internal combustion engine manufacturing base. and that does need to transition. Clearly there's concerns around jobs, but there's also the opportunities there. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to sort of, where we are in this stage of the journey and how we can ensure that the UK remains a very competitive place to invest in and grow and continue to thrive. And just noting the fact that the auto sector is very diverse across the UK, and so it sort of really helps with like a number of different factors, the levelling up agenda, the net zero agenda, the global Britain agenda, everything. Automotive can touch a lot of lives and can really move things forward. So yeah, we really want to try and build up the positivities that we can see from the report and try and build up how we can go from strength to strength here.
That's great. So if I may, a theme that came across to me very clearly from both your comments there was the changing shape of your sectors. This is something that's been known about for a while, but I think the report shows this really clearly. And your comments, Martin, about there's been a first wave, a second wave, perhaps less activity there. Now the third wave getting ready, but it's a very different world. I'm saying for automotive, as you say, for the switch from internal combustion engine and its 100+ years of history and all of those supply chains that have been built up, all of those skills. And now we see this, as you say, this incredibly rapid shift. Any comments on how that changing shape, it's not going to happen on its own, and there's always that risk that if we don't actively manage it or actively see where interventions are needed, it just kind of drifts away, as has happened in the past for other sectors. Perhaps starting with you, Matthew, any comments on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, as SMMT and the automotive sector, we've always had a very good relationship with government, and we have things like the Automotive Council, we have things like the Automotive Transformation Fund, and measures in place to try and work with government and with other stakeholders to try and ensure that we are understanding the issues and sort of doing what we can to improve the competitiveness of the UK. But as you said, it is a huge transition we're going through. We've not seen anything like it. It has to be done very rapidly, and in that pace of change is being very much almost forced upon the industry to be much quicker than potentially you would have liked to have seen in normal circumstances, with the UK pushing through end of sale dates, etc., having very high levels of ambition. And obviously, we would really like to see that backed up with, other support measures and such like. I think the UK does have a, good base to go from, but, clearly it does require a huge transition, as you mentioned, in those supply chains, moving over from, producing those ICE vehicles to having the batteries, the motors, the cell manufacturing, and everything else. It's huge. And I don't think we can be complacent at all. We have already seen sort of really good progress. So, about a quarter of the vehicles that we make in the UK are electrified in some way, and nearly 10% now are actually fully battery electric vehicles. But, clearly to move everything over, does take time and obviously huge investment from the industry.
Absolutely, and I guess one of the things that one of the reasons for doing the report is to do the international comparisons. Now, if I've got my numbers right here, Volkswagen and the Zwickau plant investing just in that one plant €1 billion to shift it entirely from internal combustion to EV. I guess that's the sort of money you're talking about, right? And that's just for one plant, admittedly quite a big plant. So it's just making sure that that is happening here, if I'm picking up on your point correctly, but at speed. We need this to happen very rapidly, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, you sort of break it down to the individual companies involved and their pace of development. We have already seen announcements that certain manufacturers are moving over to be fully electric by certain points in time, as well as then announcements about new products moving over. So we've seen announcements from Nissan to invest more in an electric vehicle and the battery plant there. We've seen sort of Lotus, Bentley announce by 2030 they'll be fully electric. We've seen Stellantis changing over one of their plants from making a petrol diesel car to making electric vans. So it is taking place. But obviously there are other companies out there which have still to make their big announcements, still to move things forward. And so we obviously have to have the supply chain there, so that even though they're making the vehicles here, they're also producing the value added components which go into them, and that's sort of a big issue. So it's been really positive that we've seen the announcements from the likes of British Volt and the Coventry sort of gigafactory plans, but it all still needs to come together and sort of really pull together in a common direction. We still don't know who the the clients for those companies are yet.
As in the battery
and
companies.
in terms of that, yeah, like British Volt and that. But you know, obviously, it's all very commercial decisions, and you know whether or not a trade association would be part of the knowledge of that. But you know, generally, that's still to be found out. But clearly, you know, there is one direction everybody has to move in towards. It's just the different paces that people are going at it. And as you said, you know, in some countries they're doing, you know, tremendous work on that side of things. Obviously, the hope is that, you know, the UK is going to follow suit and potentially then lead in certain areas. So, you know, we have seen some of the smaller manufacturers be more proactive because they're smaller, they're a bit more agile.
Right.
But then, you know, we've also seen the likes of, you know, Jaguar announced that they're going to move to electric, fully electric vehicles by 2025. So, you know, there's some positivity, but, you know, we still need the, you know, the industry as a whole to transition over.
Really interesting. And as you say, the having those tight targets really helpful. Seeing the supply chains transforming, absolutely what needs to happen. It's just got to be a bit joined up, though. That's what I'm hearing from this.
It's definitely got to be a bit joined up, and obviously, you know, it's huge investment, and at the same time, you know, people can see that there's an opportunity to steal a march, and you know, you're already seeing, you know, in the new car markets, a big transition in, you know, who are the top 10 players, and so, you know, and just at the moment, you know, there's such a transition in the sector. We've been hit by obviously quite a few issues. You know, we've had Brexit, then we've had COVID, then we've had the semiconductor issue. You know, now we've got other supply chain disruptions coming in, all at the same time when you're having to invest huge sums of money to transition the product and to encourage the consumer to move towards those products. And so, yeah, so it is a challenge, but obviously it's one that, you know, we need to succeed in because, you know, as the report also points out, you know, the automotive sector in the UK is sort of very large and very powerful and sort of supports jobs. You know, it's the largest exporter of goods. You know, so we obviously need everything to pull together to move in a direction. But
it's on very strong foundations.
It's on strong foundations, but obviously it needs a lot more to happen to really secure that transition for the overall sector, and then also for the mass, you know, market, the consumers to be sort of comfortable with that transition as well.
Sure. So no, it makes a lot of sense, and I guess picks up on a point raised by Owen in his framing remarks. This issue of the supply chains are being reconfigured and need to be reconfigured at speed to bring in new players and transfer old players as well. But if I may, linking to a question that's come in from the audience of changing industry shape, we can just bring this to pharma for a second, Martin, with this introduction, which is, you know, as you said, COVID, last 2 years, extraordinary what the pharma industry achieved in that period. I mean, just mind-blowing. Is that having, so the changes that have been pointed out in the report, has that accelerated those changes, or is it just a, dare I say, just a sort of a, we can do this, we're amazing, we've done that thing, and then we're back where we were before, or has it fundamentally changed what's happening and supported us in this transition to the third generation?
I think it's accelerated something that was already happening. So between 2012 and 2020, equity investment in the UK life sciences sector increased 1,000%. So we're already seeing an extraordinary growth, and that's built off the back of a very consistent industrial strategy from the government, which I think is absolutely vital. The pandemic did bring, I think, both fresh focus on both policymakers and investors on the importance of the life sciences sector. So, I mean, we work in a very globally competitive industry. Every country in the world now sees the value in having life sciences manufacturing on its shores. One of the reasons we missed out on that second wave is because countries like Ireland and Switzerland pushed for a lot more. They were a lot more competitive when companies were looking for where they wanted to base their manufacturing facilities. We now need to see that from the UK government, and I think we do see that from the UK government. And I think the Life Sciences Vision published last year absolutely identified that and recognised that. But you do need to take a holistic approach to the life sciences sector. We need to keep the pipeline of innovation coming. And again, I think the Life Sciences Vision identified that. We've got great assets within the NHS for both making the data available for research and learning from from the great cradle to grave linked up health service that we have in the UK. But also it's a place where we can do clinical trials much more efficiently. And again, the pandemic showed how incredibly efficient it can be with digital recruitment of patients into things like the recovery trial, which was really world leading and showed that existing medicines could be repurposed to treat COVID patients. And then, of course, we've got the Oxford University vaccine that was then commercialized by not only AstraZeneca, but a collection of SMEs that had the manufacturing capacity, but much smaller scale manufacturing capacity in the UK, but they could collectively scale up that vaccine very efficiently.
If I just interrupt, just to push back a little bit on that in a friendly, constructive way, that we've seen incredible things happen across the healthcare sector more broadly during COVID. Unbelievable achievements, an extraordinary pace, phenomenal. But then we've seen in some of those examples, we go, well, that was crisis management. That was really effective, dealing with something that was unprecedented, if we're allowed to use that word anymore. But I guess the question that's coming in is it fundamentally changing behaviors in the pharma industry? So is that stuff sticking, I suppose, is the question.
Yes, I think it does. It needs to stick within both the regulators and the companies themselves. But I think hopefully, I would say the way it's going to kind of that experience and what's happened in the past 2 years is going to fundamentally change the sector is both we've got young people coming up who now want to be like Sarah Gilbert and be the next vaccine pioneer, and perhaps even kind of want to be, if they don't want to be a researcher, but they might see that there's actually manufacturing opportunities, and we're rolling out apprenticeships in advanced medicines manufacturing so that people can not just necessarily go through the PhD route, but find other ways into the sector and find rewarding jobs. But then the other way is through just investors seeing the opportunity that life sciences can deliver, particularly in the UK. They've seen that suddenly they've become very au fait with what a clinical trial is. They're no longer scared of kind of mRNA and what that means. They've become familiar with it. So I think not just within the life sciences sector itself, but in the broader landscape that the life sciences sector relies on, such as the schools and young people coming up within policy circles, but also in the investment community. I think we've seen just a change in attitude to the sector, which I think will fundamentally change it in the years to come.
So it is a fundamental change, not just a response to an extraordinary situation. That's really positive to hear, that those learnings are being embedded and changing perceptions.
Yes, definitely.
I'm so keen to get to the discussion about skills, which I know is really clear from the report and absolutely clear from your comments just now. But Carlos, on what you've heard so far from Martin and Matthew, anything you wanted to observe at this point?
I think, what is really interesting about why we chose these two sectors, probably I didn't explain, but it's precisely because of the huge contribution they have to R&D, to value added to the manufacturing output of the country. And the fact that both are in this transition is quite interesting. I think I'm jumping to the issue of skills, Tim, but I guess we have a lot of questions that we cannot answer just by looking at the data. So for example, people refer all the time, we don't have enough technicians. Other countries have more technicians. At the same time, there's a lot of programs and things going on around that. So rather than answer any question, I wanted to pose more questions about how you perceive this issue. Is it really a lack of technicians in the industry? And the second one is around the sector definitions. I think we discussed this, especially for the pharma industry, just to make a distinction. And when we talk about R&D that takes place in the UK, most of the R&D that takes place in automotive is actually by automotive manufacturing companies, whereas only a fraction of the R&D that takes place in the UK is in pharma industry is by pharma manufacturing companies. So obviously the structure of the industries are very different. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, of why it's not in the manufacturing sector, who are the other big players, and how well are we measuring this?
Okay, first.
Please.
So I think, as I said at the beginning, the life sciences sector, pharmaceuticals, it is an industry embedded in innovation. And I'm guessing from the sector classification code, just most companies that are developing and even manufacturing medicines are view themselves and possibly report their data, etc., as a R&D intensive company and not necessarily as a manufacturing company. But I think also it comes down to the massive number of pre-commercial, pre-revenue companies. You noted this, Carlos, in your remarks. There's a wonderful, vibrant community in the UK of hundreds of life science SMEs who are all pretty much venture capital backed, some are on the public market, but they don't have a product on the market yet. They are investing all of their money into R&D. And so they are not manufacturing medicines. And the production of medicines that they do need to do, they outsource to other companies because it's incredibly costly to invest in the manufacturing facilities yourself when you don't know whether that drug is going to fail in a phase 1 clinical trial. So it makes sense to outsource it. And we have this virtual biotech model where a company can be really quite small, even though it's got an incredibly high R&D spend. And it's outsourcing that R&D to universities, to contract manufacturers, and to hospitals that are running the clinical trials as well. So I think it's a fragmented landscape, and it's a business model that is not really, something that most people who analyze businesses and analyze this data and people who collect the data as well. It's just a life sciences and biotech company just doesn't look like any other company.
So this has given us, thank you, Carlos. When I asked a question, you just asked more questions back. It's great. But maybe on this topic of skills, because it is such a strong theme there. And it links very strongly to, Matthew, what you were saying about the changing supply chains and value chains of automotive. So skills identified as an issue for automotive going through this transition. But do you think we're doing a good enough job at joining these things up? Because there's a question coming in about, are we doing enough to support technical education? I think we know there are answers to that question, but I guess what I'm trying to say is there's if we just focus on that and say, that's it, if we fix that, it would all be fine, which would certainly help. But if the industry is going through a massive fundamental reconfiguration, the skills that are needed, they're going to be different skills needed at different phases of that transition. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Can you comment a little bit on that and how that's working, if it is working?
Well, I mean, as ever, you can always do things better. There's always opportunities. I think part of the issue is also as well, is maybe a little bit in terms of classification, in terms of where, the sector is, because, potentially some of these growth areas might not be sort of traditional automotive, but they might be actually feeding into automotive.
Right.
So, like battery manufacturing has got its own SIC code, etc. And so, it would all depend sort of how all these things factor into the round. Typically, vehicle manufacturers tend to hold on to their staff and tend to sort of look to retrain them and improve them and sort of bring them with them on a journey. And so, that they tend to have quite, long-standing staff members, etc. And it tends to be not a job that people leave and sort of chop and change quite a lot.
Right.
And so that does give the sector some sort of help with the transition to new technologies, but it does also mean there's increased onus on the manufacturers to be retraining and reskilling them.
Right.
In terms of making sure the sector is an attractive place to people to move into in the future, I think that's always a challenge. Often people don't sort of like understand what manufacturing actually might involve and the different attributes that you might need to do. So, the sector is always trying to do more to encourage young people to move to the sector. I think we've in the past struggled with some of the, like the apprenticeship levies and things like that, but I think they're now working a lot better. So that is bringing people in and helping. But, sometimes some of these things don't always sort of marry up to how the industry operates, and because we tend to have like these long product cycles, typically you design a car, you make the car, then you have to sort of produce that car for sort of 7 or 8 years to sort of recoup all the value that you've invested in the development of it. And whilst at the same time, you're also then having to sort of be developing the next car and the next car and the next car. So, it's a very cyclical industry. We see that in some of the data as well, and the performances of the models in terms of how, the manufacturers perform as well, because often it's product led, if a particular product does really well, then that can sort of help that manufacturer grow and be very successful. But yeah, generally, I think we're doing, we're trying to do more, but there could be a lot more done on the skills side to really try and encourage young people to come through. I think we have as well with like the whole diversity and inclusion, aspect that can be really useful to try and sort of pull in a much broader portfolio of people and attract them to the sector. And so that's a really big area that SMMT is focusing on at the moment is how to really sort of broaden out the appeal of the sector and to encourage more and more people to join it.
So it's the sector is doing all it can to ensure that it brings the workforce in that it needs, or retrains the workforce that's already there. And you feel that with this massive sectoral change, internally that can be done, but there's going to be some external input.
I think you definitely need external input as well, because of the way the supply chains are going to have to change and the technology is changing.
Presumably, sorry to interrupt, but there'll be different suppliers. It's not just that suppliers, some will change, but there'll actually be, as you say, completely new suppliers who are not necessarily grounded in the automotive industry in the past. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, obviously, most of the suppliers that are there want to, consider direction of travel, and so want to be transitioning, and so, have got plans afoot to change as well. But clearly, it's an opportunity for new people to come in. And then, as I said, sometimes those sort of new companies coming in might not be sort of traditional automotive companies, might not classify themselves as traditional automotive companies, but they might still be feeding through the technologies that the sector does need to deliver in the future. And so, the whole sort of future of the jobs in the automotive sector is obviously quite a challenge at the moment of where it goes. And, it's still unclear where that will land, whether or not the transition will mean there'll be net growth or a contraction in the actual number of employees, but it could also mean that, you see less in the traditional automotive manufacturing sectors, but there's growth in other areas which actually are still feeding into automotive.
So things like digital electronics, all of that stuff. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, interesting. So maybe already planning the next year's report, but that issue of the industries kind of reclassifying themselves. As you say, automotive is a very fuzzy boundary now, and it's changing quite a lot. Yeah. And I guess we've heard, Martin, as well, that very similar in pharmaceutical. The boundaries are becoming fuzzier. Is that fair to say, as you position yourself within a changing healthcare market?
I suppose, yes, in that, it's not just about medicines that you swallow or inject. There's a greater diversity of technologies coming through that improve health, but still have their grounding in kind of physiological medicine. So, wearables and devices, that type of thing. And so if you're just looking at the R&D spend, for example, of companies developing pharmaceuticals, you are going to miss out on that wide range of other companies as well. And I would also say, I think the way the ONS does its sampling in the first place could potentially be missing out on the huge explosion of investment that we've had in SMEs over the past few years. So, I mean, it was £4.5 billion last year was invested into UK life science SMEs. As I said earlier, an increase of 1,000% since 2012. But we certainly don't see that in the R&D spend at the moment. And I would be very interested to know if they are sampling a wide range of companies, even ones that have just emerged in the past few years, but may have easily received their first Series A of investment of £100 million. That money has to go into R&D. They're not doing anything else with it.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that will be something to look into in your next report.
This is writing itself now. So what I'd really like to do now, is we're about halfway through the discussion, is I've been trying to interweave questions from the audience into the discussion here. There are some quite specific ones that I'd really like us to focus on. And please do keep sending the questions in. So some are very broad, some are quite specific. And just one that kind of quite broad here, this issue of a lot of the data in the report relates to R&D, understandably. How effective is that actually a measure of innovation? I mean, it is one of the measures for sure, but do we risk actually taking a rather narrow view of things if we overemphasize that? Sorry to pick on you, Carlos, but you wrote the report.
No, I think that's a fair point, and precisely, I think, as Owen mentioned at the beginning, the reason why we are interested in industrial innovation is because we want to make the difference that is not just innovation or R&D and patent indicators, but we put it alongside data on the performance of the sectors. So we don't understand probably the wiring diagram that's going from R&D to value added in a given sector, but by putting the data next to each other, we can have these conversations about what is the implication of reduce or increasing expenditure on R&D and patents with increased trade balance or value added. So we are not suggesting that is just one or the key indicator. And many reports look at different types of inputs and outputs of innovation. I think you refer, Martin, to the productivity as well of the academic sector in the UK. There's other reports that are looking at that inputs and outputs, but from the innovation side. What we want to do is to relate that to industrial performance, to jobs, to value added per capita, because that in the end, value added means you're sharing the GDP of the country. So how is that increasing? And value added per capita means your contribution to the productivity of the country. So we're not saying we have the perfect set of proxies or indicators, but what we're suggesting is let's have a discussion looking at the economic data as well.
So it's very much that getting to an even more sophisticated understanding of that wiring diagram. How does this really affect it? You've got to measure it as a starting point. The effects of it are not immediately clear, but it's becoming clearer the deeper you dig.
Yes, and as you see in the net zero section, for example, just to highlight that we find that UK is leading R&D expenditure, patenting data, but as I mentioned, 10 out of 17 sectors in this economy actually are declining. So yes, in the UK, in the net zero strategy, some of the data that is given there, we have captured. But if you zoom out of the data, actually you see a declining trend in some of the sectors. Of course, you have good sectors or better performing sectors like offshore, and in certain regions, obviously like Scotland. But what we're saying is, okay, we're doing great in R&D and patents, but something is going on, that the actual economy, the actual jobs, and the actual number of business in this sector is declining. So that's what we need to understand better.
So maybe if I can open up to Matthew and Martin as well. So this very clear target, which is a target for R&D, the 2.4%, now going to have to be upgraded to 2.5%. Is this, for your sectors, the right thing on which to focus? Or is this, it's as Carlos says, it's an indicator. What you're really interested in is what happens as a result of that. Any comments on that? Maybe starting with you, Matthew?
Yeah, completely. So I mean, obviously, whilst the R&D number is really great, and to sort of see that progress, we tend to look at the number of jobs, the growth, the value added that we've done, and the turnover. I mean, as SMT, we tend to focus on the number of cars produced, the number of cars sold. They think they're like typically the big numbers that we look at and people look to us about. But clearly the R&D, it is helpful to show the direction of travel that the industry is moving to, the fact that it's pulling its weight in terms of developing things for the future and moving things forward. So,
and sorry, I mean to cut you off. Just that, and that issue of an industry going through a massive transition, the links to R&D, presumably it's incredibly critical that it's not just what's happening in the immediate future, what your members are facing right now, but what they're going to be facing in 5 to 10 years, because this isn't a switch to electric, we're done. It's going to be, there's a whole series of emerging technologies and all sorts of different battery technologies and all of that. So I'm guessing that the link to R&D is hugely important, but perhaps less so right now. You've got a more urgent focus.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have urgent focuses around sort of, supplies and things like that. But yeah, I mean, typically, the car that you're producing today, you probably designed sort of 10 years ago,
Right.
and it's sort of taken that long to go through all the, you know, the tests and everything to bring it to market and such like. And so, yeah, you're always looking at the future. You always got to be innovative. You know, it is a very competitive market. You know, the margins are relatively small. You're in a global marketplace, so you're always looking to improve your product and take things forward. So, yeah, I mean, definitely, you know, it's a good indicator, but it's in a package, you know, and you're always looking at how the package is performing to see how the sector's.
And I guess that, sorry, and just emphasising that point, if I may, that hence the international comparison is so important to see not just what's being spent elsewhere, but how it's being spent and how it links. And maybe, Martin, to you, comments on that? R&D is a useful indicator. Is it the right one?
I mean, for a start, the 2.4% target is a target, and I think it's helpful to have the government and both sides of Parliament, the opposition as well, agreed that increasing R&D expenditure is really important, and both increasing public and private R&D expenditure as well. And there are benefits that come just from achieving that. I mean, very well-paid jobs and all the spillover benefits, particularly in our sector where NHS patients, for example, get to take part in clinical trials on the most innovative and advanced medicine available to them. So there's lots of benefits. I think as an indicator, it's one thing and it's useful, but you've got to look at everything else. Definitely, just like Matt was saying, with jobs and I mean, blockbuster drugs, you know, anything that's selling over £1 billion globally, very valuable to have, whether you are manufacturing it in the UK or just reinvesting that money from that in new innovation. If we were to anchor the kind of downstream benefits, the productivity growth, the manufacturing that Carlos was talking about, it's going to take a lot more than just the R&D investment, as important as that is. It's going to take initiatives to anchor that investment. For example, capital grants a capital grant scheme has just been announced by the government today to anchor manufacturing in the medicines manufacturing in the UK. It's going to take a supportive tax environment, not just the top line business rate, but personal taxation and the incentives for venture capital investment and everything else as well. So if we're to, the 2.4% target is excellent. Just raising R&D investment is a very worthy aim, but if we're to then get the downstream benefits of that, we need these other policies that will secure them.
It's almost like this was planned. So you're now leading directly into the next question that's coming from the audience, which is around this issue of scale up. And or is there in some sectors there clearly is, a weakness in our ability to cross what used to be called, and maybe still is, the valley of death, that we can pump all of that great money into R&D, all of that great money into getting things started. But when push comes to shove, someone with very deep pockets comes from elsewhere and just goes, yep, thank you very much. We have the ability to, for the sake of that business, we have the ability to scale it up more effectively elsewhere. Is that a concern?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's perpetually and historically a problem that many people raise, particularly about the life sciences sector. It's incredibly expensive to develop a medicine. It can easily take over £1 billion in 15 years. It's very hard for an individual small startup company to take it all that way and convince someone to invest all of that money in it. So traditionally, and still, the general business model in our sector is to get bought out by a larger company, a pharmaceutical company that has not only the money, but the infrastructure to run the very large global clinical trials that it requires. But we are seeing, I think, that model changing, partly because of changes to regulation that allow you to get medicines authorized, particularly for rare diseases, based on a much smaller patient population, therefore clinical trials are cheaper, but also just innovation in the way that life sciences R&D takes place, increased use of AI and other technologies that mean that they are lowering the cost of the full clinical development pipeline, and therefore it's more realistic for an SME to make it all the way. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, a company called Immunocore, which is an Oxford-based biotech, has been going for a good 15 years or so. That finally got its first medicine approved by the FDA, the American Food and Drug Administration, showing that a single UK biotech company can go all the way if it wants to. It did have to tap into US capital. And I think that is something, again, it's the life sciences vision did identify this. If you're not getting bought out by an overseas company in the life sciences sector, you are probably getting investment, equity investment from US and other investors around the world. And the US particularly is the biggest market in the world for medicine. So there's already a natural gravitation for life sciences companies to move over there. And we're never going to be able to fight that fully. But having investment from America, although that investment is incredibly welcome, it does again move that gravitational pull further over the Atlantic, and you want to base your leadership team in America to be close to the investors. So if we can get more UK investors putting their money into our companies for the long term, you know, what we call patient capital, money that will stick there with the company for 5, 10, 15 years, the amount of time it takes to develop a medicine. If we can get more UK investors involved in our sector and investing into it, we can create more of an incentive for those companies to keep their operations and the leadership teams in the UK and create a virtuous circle of scale up in the UK.
Absolutely get that. If we were to have this event 10 years ago, that question about valley of death and inability to scale up and overseas investment would have come up exactly the same, maybe 20 years ago probably as well. In terms of your earlier comments about the changing shape of the industry, and then linking to Carlos's comment and the data about the importance of anchoring and the strong need to link R&D to manufacturing, do you see us in a good position from that perspective? So not just it's the old model, we can slightly improve it, and that could be very useful, but actually the industry is changing and we now have a chance to do something different if we had more investment coming in.
Yes, I mean, I think if we do have more investment coming in, it is making it more realistic for life science companies to scale up in the UK. And we also have a government that is more willing to take interventions to incentivize those companies to not only do their R&D in the UK, but also their manufacturing in the UK.
Makes a lot of sense. So, Carlos, I'm desperately trying to weave all of these questions into these questions. That's been really helpful. Thank you for that. Carlos, any comments specifically on that issue? Starting where we did a few minutes ago on R&D being the right measure. Are we investing not enough in the scale-up activities? Any comments or anything from your evidence that you want to share at this point?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a very interesting analysis about the 2.4% target. I think one of the ideas, of course, is looking at specific sectors is to give this message that sector composition of the economy matters. So if all the sectors in the economy were as R&D intensive as automotive and pharma are, we would be in a very different position. So the issue is how big these R&D intensive sectors are in the economy. So, for example, there's studies of Korea has over 3% of R&D, of GDP in R&D already. But it's really concentrated in a couple of sectors, obviously electronics, automotive. But if you look at the rest, they're actually below the 2.4% target. So it is really a couple of sectors driving that 3% up. And there's some studies actually in the EU that calculated what would the UK need to reach 3%, actually, where they were looking at 3%, not 2.4. And they say, well, all you need to do is to double your share of manufacturing in the economy. I mean, obviously, but it's just, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we need to look at those sectors, and that's why it's so important to look at specifically those R&D intensive sectors, how they are performing, because again, 3/4 of R&D comes from the manufacturing sector, so it is important for the target, but also specifically industries like pharma and auto. So yes, that's one point. Composition matters for a 2.4%, regardless of whether there's a good target or not. And yeah, and the scale up, I think what is striking in the last couple of years is this increasing recognition in the UK innovation strategy and the life science vision of the importance of local production capabilities to resilience. So many people saying we perhaps were driven by short-term cost considerations when planning our supply chain or planning where to locate facilities, but now we understand how important it is to have that capability to produce vaccines locally, to have the capabilities locally as well. And yeah, I think your question is the right one. We still don't know whether that is a shift that is going to stay, and that recognition will stay also in the future.
Interesting. Thank you for that. I guess we're heading towards the final few questions now. So again, if I could just warn you as panelists, if there's any final comment you want to make, I'll give you a chance at the end. But just picking up on a couple of other questions there that have come through, there's this particular issue around bringing back, to your point, Matthew, about the joining up the dots, the ability to have strategic thinking. And I'll put it out as the question that arrived in my inbox here. Is the UK better at tactics, creating solutions to specific problems, and less good at leadership and strategy for the longer term?
That's a big old question.
And I guess maybe just to frame it slightly, I suspect that's in the context of things like the ventilator challenge, the vaccine development, all of those great things that happened, which were spectacular, which absolutely should be celebrated. But if we're going through massive, for our most important sectors, there's huge transitions. Have we got the right guidance, the right support to make that happen? And the transition from ICE to EV is a clear example, I guess, where you said there's some really good things happening, but not quite everything.
Yeah, I mean, typically, UK engineers are some of the best in the world, and we lead the way in things like Formula One. On an automotive scale, we lead the way, and even in the the COVID times when they switched from vehicle manufacturing to producing PPE and ventilators and things like that, they managed to find a way to sort of transition and help. I think in terms of where the sector goes more broadly, that is very difficult. Obviously most of the companies in terms of the volume producers, so the volume employers, are foreign owned, and so so that is an issue that we do have to address. But at the same time, you can still make the UK a very attractive place to manufacture those vehicles and bring the jobs and the wealth creation that creates. We do have very highly skilled engineering companies here, which are sort of world leaders and are developing things. As I mentioned, because you've got this ability to transition, but it is largely a jeopardy question, really, because at the moment, most of the gains are really coming from outside of, well, maybe not even outside just to the UK, but outside of Europe. With the growth of the Chinese, the Korean manufacturers, that they are using it as an opportunity with this big transition to sort of have these sort of game changing technologies, and the traditional brand values of products are also being sort of quite heavily distorted at the moment now, because you've got this transition, so it enables somebody to change. So you do have to. There are a lot of concerns. But I think the UK can succeed and still done that, and we've bounced back in the past. There's obviously no reason that we will continue to always flourish, but the UK does tend to do very well. It does tend to be highly skilled engineers that are the workforce tends to be quite flexible, which really helps as well. So it does sort of lean itself to sort of being able to sort of deliver in the future. But again, as ever, you definitely need that sort of industry, government, all stakeholders moving in a common direction, especially when you've got these massive transitions, and especially when you've got a government which is imposing the big transitions, has really got to be there supporting and encouraging that transition, and sort of actually sort of focusing some of their resource on that.
Absolutely. So this point about fantastic to have absolutely clear goals set, but the ability to then follow through in the light of evidence coming from overseas of these staggering investments that are being made elsewhere, just on battery technologies alone, and all the associated issues with that. So on this particular topic, Martin, it is a very broad question, this issue of tactics versus strategy, but just any comments on that from your industry's perspective, your sector's perspective?
I mean, I think I disagree with the premise of the question to an extent. I mean, the vaccine didn't come out of nowhere. It was based on years and years of research. The Oxford team at the Jenner Institute being funded by the Medical Research Council and Innovate UK, tactical investments that were not obviously focused on addressing COVID, but allowed the academic team to pivot and and apply their technology to a new area.
So really providing those foundations on which other things could be built.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's what a good strategy does, is it lays the foundations. And it also identifies the problems that need solving. And I think the life sciences vision does do that very well. So, you know, issues around access to data in the NHS. So as I was saying earlier, we've got a brilliant wealth of data out there, but actually curating it and making it the right structured in the right way for researchers to access it, be they academic or industry researchers, is a huge task. But it rightly identifies that it must be done. And we've seen £200 million invested in it announced today to make that happen. It also rightly identifies access to finance, as we've talked about, need to get more scale-up finance into companies so that they can grow in the UK. And it also identifies that the NHS is historically a poor adopter of innovation, which again kind of feeds through to industry potentially not basing itself here, because the NHS is not going to be a partner in developing that medicine and trialing it and then eventually adopting it into the standard of care as well. So the life sciences vision rightly identifies those things and does set a strategy to try and address them. So yes, I think we, if we haven't been good at strategy in the past, and I would slightly question whether we have or haven't, I think we will be in the future. But of course, it all requires the government to really focus on the delivery of that and make the investments that are required.
Excellent. Thank you both very much for that. We're just going to wrap things up. We've got a few minutes left. Carlos, anything you wanted to say to kind of put together any strands or things that have not been covered so far you wanted to highlight?
I think just going back up to the skills issue, I think that it's clear that both industries and in general industry is in transition, and therefore some of the most exciting career opportunities for young people actually are in this industry. So contrary to the perception of that many people might have, it is quite a good time to go and do science and engineering in the UK. And I think that is very clear by the transitions and the new areas coming in and the convergence of different sectors and the scale up of the technologies. That is going to be an area of growth. So I think that we need to understand that better. We need to, and from our side, we would like to understand better the future skill needs, as you said, by looking at how the future supply chains are going to look and what is needed. But certainly a very exciting area there.
Brilliant. Martin, any closing comments you wanted to make?
I would just say, I mean, congratulations on publishing a good report. We're very keen to support it in the future.
Wonderful, thank you. Matthew.
Likewise, excuse me. I think the other thing as well is always, we've got to remember the fundamentals of what makes the UK a good place to invest. So you've got to have, those in place. You've got to have, like low cost, low carbon energy, all those sorts of things, as well as, the R&D platform, etc. So it really is a big sort of mixture of things to pull it together.
Great, thank you for that. And maybe just, I've done my best. I haven't done brilliantly well here going through all the questions that were asked, but thank you for being so responsive to my slightly strange style of questioning that was trying to weave this all together. I guess it just remains then to say the report is available for download from the CIIP website. We'd love to hear feedback on it, and for any comments or questions on it, and suggestions for the 2023 report would be gratefully received. But I think I'd just loop back to a comment made that's appeared several times through our discussion here, made by Owen OSullivan in the framing of this event, which was it's the changing shape of supply chains is what makes it particularly important that we look at this in detail now. It's not as if we're saying these sectors exist, they're performing in a certain way, we can measure it, and we can measure changes in performance. They're fundamentally changing to different degrees and in different ways. But that's why I think this report is so critical. So thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to everybody who's contributed inputs to the report, who's been involved in the analysis, who's been involved in the writing and the publication and in organising this event. I think that's it. Thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Bye for now.